If your own brother's flesh of your flesh, blood of your blood, sold you into slavery, if you were falsely accused and thrown into a dungeon where darkness becomes your only companion, would you still believe that this very path of agony was God's highway to glory? This is the story of a man who could see the future in his dreams, but could not foresee the tragedy that would befall his own life. A story where betrayal becomes blessing, where the pit becomes the palace, where the prison becomes the pathway to power. In the ancient scrolls of Genesis, written with ink made from crushed stones and tears of prophets, lies a narrative so profound that it echoes through millennia. It speaks to every soul who has ever wondered why good people suffer, why the innocent are punished, why dreams given by God Himself seem to die in the darkness of human cruelty. Listen carefully, for this is not merely a tale from dusty parchments. This is your story, my story, the story of every dreamer who has ever been thrown into a pit. Part 1. The beloved sun, the sun rises over the hills of Hebron, painting the ancient land of Canaan in hues of gold and amber. The morning mist clings to the valleys like a gossamer veil, and the bleating of sheep echoes across the rocky terrain. This is the land promised to Abraham, inherited by Isaac, and now home to Jacob and his 12 sons. But on this particular morning, as on every morning for the past 17 years, one figure stands apart from the rest. Joseph, son of Rachel, the beloved wife, who died too young, leaving behind only 2 sons, and a grief that never quite healed in Jacob's heart. The boy stands at the entrance of his father's tent, and even from a distance he is unmistakable, not because of his height, for he is still young and growing, not because of his strength, for his brothers are all mighty men, hardened by years of shepherding in the wilderness. No, Joseph stands out because of what he wears, a coat of many colors, a garment so magnificent that it seems to capture and reflect every ray of the morning sun. Each thread in that coat tells a story. The deep purple dyed from the murex shells of Tyre speaks of royalty. The crimson extracted from crushed insects, found only in the far reaches of the desert, whispers of passion and favor. The blue derived from the precious indigo plant sings of the heavens above. Gold threads run through it all, catching the light like trapped starfire. Jacob had commissioned this coat from the finest weavers in all of Canaan. For weeks they had labored their nimble fingers, working the loom with an artistry passed down through generations. When they presented it to Jacob, even they seemed amazed at what they had created. It was more than a garment. It was a declaration, a pronouncement that could not be misunderstood. This coat declared to the world, and more importantly to Joseph's 11 brothers, that Joseph was the chosen one. He was the heir, the beloved, the one upon whom their father's blessing would ultimately rest. Every morning when Joseph emerged wearing that coat, it was like salt being rubbed into an ever-festering wound. The brothers, strong men who could wrestle wild beasts and survive the harshest desert storms, found themselves wrestling with something far more dangerous, jealousy, that green-eyed monster that had been destroying families since Cain looked upon Abel with murderous intent. Reuben, the firstborn, should have worn that coat. By all rights and traditions, he was the heir. But he had defiled his father's bed, sleeping with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and in doing so had forfeited his birthright. Still, the sting remained. Every time he saw Joseph in that coat, he remembered his failure his moment of weakness that had cost him everything. Simeon and Levi, the second and third sons, were men of violence. They had slaughtered an entire city to avenge their sister Dinah's honor. Their father had cursed their anger, saying it was fierce, and their wrath cruel. They would never inherit the blessing, but knowing this did not make the sight of Joseph any easier to bear. If anything, it made it worse. They had acted to defend family honor, and their reward was rejection. Joseph had done nothing but be born to the right mother, and he received everything. Judah, the fourth son, was a natural leader. The other brothers looked to him for guidance, respected his wisdom, followed his commands. In any other family, he would have been the undisputed heir. But in this family, in this twisted dynamic of favorites and outcasts, he was just another son, watching from the sidelines, as a boy nearly half his age strutted around in a coat that should have belonged to someone worthier. The sons of the concubines, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, had never really expected to inherit much. They were used to being second class, used to receiving the leftovers. But even they felt the burn of injustice. At least they were older, more experienced, harder working. What had Joseph ever done except be Daddy's favorite Issachar, and Zebulun, Leah's younger sons, had grown up in the shadow of their older brother's failures and violence. They had hoped that perhaps their steadiness, their quiet loyalty, might earn them some recognition. But no, it was always Joseph, always the son of Rachel, always the reminder that their mother Leah had never been loved the way Rachel was loved. And then there was Benjamin, the youngest, the only other son of Rachel. He alone among the brothers did not hate Joseph. He was too young to fully understand the dynamics at play, and Joseph had always been kind to him, protective even. In Benjamin's eyes, Joseph was not a rival, but a protector, a second father figure who told him stories and taught him about the God of their fathers. But Joseph, wrapped in his coat of many colors, seemed oblivious to the hurricane of hatred swirling around him. Or perhaps he was not oblivious. Perhaps he simply did not care. He was 17 in age, where boys believe themselves invincible, where the future stretches out like an endless golden road, where dreams seem more real than the harsh realities of family politics. He would walk among his brothers, reporting on their activities to their father. Reuben was lazy with the sheep today, he would say. Simeon and Levi were fighting again. Judah disappeared for hours, leaving the flock unattended. Every word was true, but truth can be a weapon sharper than any sword when wielded without wisdom or compassion. The brothers would grit their teeth and say nothing. What could they say? Joseph was not lying. He was simply being what their father had made him, a spy, a talebearer, a walking reminder of their inadequacy. They could not strike him, for their father's wrath would be terrible. They could not speak kindly to him, for the words would choke in their throats. So they did the only thing they could do. They hated him in silence, and their hatred grew like a cancer, eating away at whatever brotherly affection might once have existed. But the coat, as magnificent and divisive as it was, would soon pale in comparison to what was coming. For Joseph was about to receive something far more precious and dangerous than any garment. He was about to receive visions from the Almighty Himself. And Part 2. Dreams of Destiny. The night came softly to the tents of Jacob, as it had for countless generations of nomads in this ancient land. The stars emerged one by one like diamonds scattered across black velvet, each one a silent witness to the drama about to unfold. The cooking fires died down to glowing embers, and the sounds of the camp gradually faded into the rhythmic breathing of sleep. But in Joseph's tent, sleep brought no peace. Instead, it brought visions, vivid, startling, unmistakably divine. In the first dream, Joseph found himself in a vast field of grain. The sun was at its zenith, beating down mercilessly on the golden stalks that stretched as far as the eye could see. He was there with his brothers, all 12 of them, working side by side, binding sheaves of wheat. The work was hard, backs bent under the scorching sun, hands bleeding from the rough stalks. But then something extraordinary happened. Joseph's sheaf, which he had just finished binding, suddenly stood upright of its own accord. It rose from the ground as if pulled by invisible strings, standing tall and proud in the center of the field. And then, in a scene that defied all natural law, the sheaves his brothers had bound began to move. They circled around Joseph's sheaf like courtiers around a king. And then, one by one, they bowed down. 11 sheaves, prostrating themselves before the one that stood in the center. Joseph woke with a start, his heart pounding, sweat beating on his forehead despite the cool night air. The image was burned into his mind with a clarity that no ordinary dream possessed. He knew with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than thought that this was no mere product of his sleeping mind. This was a message, a revelation, a glimpse into a future that God Himself had ordained. The next morning, Joseph could not contain himself. As the family gathered for the morning meal, sitting in a circle on the ground, sharing bread and dried fruit and goat's milk, Joseph stood up. His eyes were shining with an inner light, his whole being radiating excitement. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying across the circle, "I must tell you about my dream." The reaction was immediate. Spoons stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes turned to Joseph, and in those eyes was a mixture of annoyance and apprehension. They knew that look on his face. It was the same look he had when he came to report their misdeeds to their father. Last night, Joseph continued, either oblivious to or ignoring the tension, "I dreamed we were all binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, heavy and oppressive, charged with electricity. Judah's jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like cords in his neck. Simeon's hands curled into fists. Levi's face turned a deep, dangerous red. It was Reuben who finally spoke, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, little brother, you will reign over us. You will indeed have dominion over us." But before Joseph could answer, before anyone could fully process the implications of this dream, Simeon exploded. "Who do you think you are?" he roared, jumping to his feet. "You walk around here in your pretty coat telling tales to Father, and now you dream of us bowing to you?" Levi was on his feet too, his hand moving instinctively to where his sword would hang. Perhaps we should teach the dreamer a lesson about respect. But Jacob raised his hand and silence fell again. The old patriarch's face was unreadable, his eyes moving slowly from son to son, finally resting on Joseph. "Sit down, all of you," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "It is just a dream." But even as he said the words, Jacob's mind was racing. He knew about dreams from God. Had not his grandfather Abraham received visions in the night? Had not he himself wrestled with an angel and seen a ladder stretching to heaven? This dream of Joseph's, could it be? The meal continued in strained silence, but the damage was done. The dream had been spoken, the words could not be taken back. The brothers ate mechanically, their minds churning with dark thoughts. If they had hated Joseph before now, their hatred had a focus, a specific image to rage against. Themselves, proud sons of Israel, bowing before this arrogant boy. But Joseph, in his youthful naivety, or perhaps driven by a compulsion he could not resist, was not done. 3 nights later, another dream came even more audacious than the first. This time he found himself standing in a place that seemed to be neither earth nor heaven, but somewhere in between. Above him the cosmos spread out in all its glory. The sun blazed with a fierce golden light, the moon glowed with silver radiance, and 11 stars sparkled like jewels against the darkness of space. As Joseph watched in awe, these celestial bodies began to move. They descended from their heights, drawing closer and closer to where he stood. And then, in a moment that took his breath away, they all bowed down before him. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars all prostrating themselves in cosmic submission. When Joseph woke from this dream, he was trembling. This was bigger than sheaves of wheat. This was the very order of creation acknowledging his authority. He lay in his tent until dawn, wrestling with the magnitude of what he had seen. Should he tell anyone? Could he keep such a vision to himself? By morning, the compulsion to share overwhelmed his caution. This time he told not just his brothers, but his father as well. The entire family was gathered, including the wives and concubines and younger children. Joseph stood before them, all his coat of many colors catching the morning light, and related his dream. "I have dreamed another dream," he announced, his voice carrying a strange mixture of awe and certainty. "This time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." The reaction was volcanic. The brothers erupted in angry shouts and bitter laughter. "The sun and moon, too," Judah said with bitter mockery. "Not content with your brothers as servants, you need our parents to bow as well." But it was Jacob's reaction that surprised everyone. The old man who had always defended Joseph, who had always shown favoritism to his beloved son, now stood with anger flashing in his eyes. "What is this dream that you have dreamed?" Jacob demanded, his voice sharp with rebuke. "Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" The reference to your mother was particularly painful, as Rachel was dead. Was Jacob referring to Leah, who had taken Rachel's place as primary wife? Or was this dream speaking of something beyond the current reality? Something that transcended even death? Joseph stood there suddenly, looking very young and vulnerable despite his magnificent coat. For the first time he seemed to realize the full impact of his words. His father, his protector, his champion, was angry with him. The brother's hatred he could bear, but his father's displeasure was something else entirely. I only told what I saw," Joseph stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. Jacob's anger seemed to cool as quickly as it had flared. He looked at his son, this beautiful boy, who looked so much like his beloved Rachel, and his expression softened. But his words remained firm. "Keep your dreams to yourself from now on," he said. "Dreams can be dangerous things." But even as Jacob publicly rebuked Joseph privately, his mind was working. He knew the language of dreams, the vocabulary of visions. These were not the random fantasies of an arrogant youth. They had the ring of prophecy about them, the weight of divine destiny. The old man stored these things in his heart, pondering them, wondering what God was planning for this favored son. The brothers, however, had no such theological musings. To them, the dreams were the final insult, the last straw on an already breaking camel's back. They dispersed from the gathering in small groups, muttering among themselves their hatred now mixed with something else, fear. What if the dreams were true? What if somehow, someway they would find themselves bowing before Joseph? The thought was unbearable. Simeon pulled Levi aside. "We cannot let this continue," he hissed. "The boy grows more arrogant by the day. Soon he will have father give him everything, and we will be left with nothing." Levi nodded grimly. "But what can we do? Father watches him like a hawk. If we so much as raise a hand to him—" "Then we wait," Judah interrupted, having overheard their conversation. "We wait for our opportunity. Father cannot watch him forever. And when the chance comes—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the meaning was clear. Dan and Naphtali, sons of Bilhah, had their own conference. "Perhaps the dreams mean something different," Dan suggested hopefully. "Perhaps they speak of a distant future when we are all old and gray." "Or perhaps," Naphtali replied darkly, "they mean nothing at all. Perhaps they are just the delusions of a spoiled child who has been told too often that he is special." Gad and Asher, sons of Zilpah, were more practical in their assessment. "Dreams or no dreams," Gad said, "Joseph is still father's favorite. That will not change." "Unless," Asher added thoughtfully, "Joseph himself changes, or is changed." The ominous nature of that statement hung in the air between them. Only Benjamin, young and innocent, seemed unaffected by the turmoil. He sought out Joseph later that day, finding his older brother sitting alone by the well, seemingly lost in thought. "Joseph," Benjamin said softly, "were the dreams real? Did God really show you these things?" Joseph looked at his little brother, the only one who still looked at him with love rather than hatred, and his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, Benjamin. I think so. They felt real, more real than anything I've ever experienced. But now—" He gestured helplessly at the camp where his other brothers moved about, pointedly ignoring him. "Now I wish I had never dreamed them at all." Benjamin sat down beside him, his small hand reaching out to touch Joseph's arm. "Maybe," he said with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children, "the dreams are not about making you great. Maybe they're about something else, something we can't understand yet." Joseph looked at his little brother in surprise. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. But what could the dreams mean, if not what they obviously showed? What purpose could there be in showing him his family bowing before him, if not to reveal his future greatness? As the sun set that day, painting the sky in shades of red that looked disturbingly like blood, Joseph sat alone in his tent, fingering the threads of his many-colored coat. The garment that had once filled him with such pride now felt heavy, burdensome. The dreams that had seemed like promises now felt like curses. He did not know that within days his brothers would act on their hatred. He did not know that the very gifts that seemed to mark him for greatness, the coat and the dreams, would be the catalysts for his descent into slavery. He did not know that the path to the fulfillment of those dreams would lead through the darkest valleys any man could walk. All he knew was that something had changed. The dreams had been spoken, and words like arrows loosed from a bow could not be called back. The die was cast, the wheel set in motion, and somewhere in the heavens, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob watched and waited his plan, unfolding exactly as he had ordained from the foundation of the world. Part 3. The Pit of Despair. The morning came like any other, with no hint of the tragedy about to unfold. The sun rose over the hills of Hebron. Birds sang their morning songs, and the daily rhythm of nomadic life began anew. Jacob sat at the entrance of his tent, his weathered hands holding a cup of warm goat's milk, his eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced gaze of a lifetime shepherd. "Joseph," he called, and immediately his favorite son appeared resplendent as always in his coat of many colors. "Yes, Father?" Jacob's expression was troubled. "Your brothers have taken the flocks to Shechem for pasture. They have been gone for many days, and I have heard no word. I am concerned." Joseph understood his father's worry. Shechem was the place where Simeon and Levi had slaughtered an entire city. It was a place of bad memories and potential danger, if the relatives of those killed sought revenge. "Go now," Jacob continued, "and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring me word." Joseph bowed his head in acknowledgement. "I will go at once, Father." As Joseph prepared for the journey, Jacob helped him pack provisions, bread, dried fruit, water skins, a knife for protection. The old man's hands lingered on his son's shoulders, and for a moment, just a moment, a shadow of premonition crossed his face. "Be careful, my son," he said softly, "and come back to me safely." "I will, Father. Do not worry." Those would be the last words Jacob would hear from his beloved son for 22 long years. The journey to Shechem took 3 days. Joseph walked alone, his coat a bright splash of color against the dull browns and grays of the wilderness. He sang as he walked old songs his mother Rachel had taught him before she died, songs of God's faithfulness and protection. He had no idea he was walking toward his doom. When he reached Shechem, the pastures were empty. No sheep, no shepherds, no sign of his brothers. Joseph stood in the vacant field, puzzled and increasingly worried. Where could they have gone? A man found him, wandering in the fields, looking lost and concerned. "What are you seeking, the stranger asked. "I am seeking my brothers," Joseph replied. "They were pasturing the flocks here. Have you seen them?" The man nodded. "I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.' They left several days ago." Joseph thanked the man and set off for Dothan, another day's journey north. He did not notice that the stranger watched him go with a peculiar expression, as if he knew more than he was saying. Some would later say this was no ordinary man, but an angel ensuring that Joseph would meet his destiny. Meanwhile, in the pastures near Dothan, the 11 brothers sat around their midday fire, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese. The conversation, as it had for days, centered on their absent brother. "I wonder what tales he's telling Father about us now," Simeon said bitterly. Probably describing more dreams where we polish his sandals, Levi added with a harsh laugh. It was Naphtali with his sharp eyes who spotted the figure approaching from the south. At first, it was just a speck on the horizon, shimmering in the heat waves rising from the baked earth. But as it drew closer, the distinctive colors became visible. "Look," he said, pointing. "Someone comes." They all turned to look, shading their eyes against the harsh sun. And then Judah spoke the words that would change everything. "Behold, the dreamer comes." The very air seemed to change, becoming thick with menace. The brothers looked at each other, and in that moment, years of suppressed rage crystallized into deadly intent. "Now is our chance," Simeon said, his voice low and dangerous. "Father is far away. No one else is here. We can end this once and for all." "Kill him," Levi agreed, his hand already on his knife. "We'll throw his body into one of these cisterns and say a wild beast devoured him. Then we shall see what becomes of his dreams," Gad added with grim satisfaction. But Reuben, the eldest, felt a cold fear grip his heart. Murder. Were they really contemplating murdering their own brother? He thought quickly, desperately. "No," he said firmly. "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." Secretly, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. It was a weak plan born of cowardice as much as compassion, but it was the best he could manage in the heat of the moment. The brothers agreed, though Simeon and Levi seemed disappointed at being denied their blood vengeance. They settled back down, pretending to continue their meal, waiting for Joseph to arrive like spiders waiting for a fly. Joseph, meanwhile, approached with increasing anticipation. He could see his brothers now gathered around their fire. His heart, incredibly, was light. He had found them. Father would be so relieved. Perhaps this successful mission would even soften his brothers' hearts toward him. Perhaps they could finally be a real family. "Brothers," he called out as he drew near, waving his hand in greeting. "Father sends his greetings. He was worried when—" He never finished the sentence. They fell upon him like wolves on a lamb. Hands grabbed him from every direction, rough and violent. Joseph's cry of surprise turned to one of fear as he was thrown to the ground. Dust filled his mouth and nose. Knees pressed into his back, hands held his arms and legs. "Brothers, what are you doing? Stop, please!" But his pleas fell on deaf ears. With savage fury, they tore at his coat, the beautiful coat of many colors. The sound of ripping fabric filled the air, each tear like a scream. Joseph watched in horror as the symbol of his father's love was reduced to tattered rags. "Not so special now, are you?" Simeon snarled, his face inches from Joseph's. "Where are your dreams now, little brother?" Levi mocked. Joseph's mind reeled in shock and terror. This couldn't be happening. These were his brothers, his own flesh and blood. Surely this was some cruel joke, some harsh lesson they meant to teach him. Surely they would stop. But they didn't stop. They dragged him struggling and pleading to the edge of a deep cistern. It was an old well dug generations ago now, dry and abandoned. The opening yawned like a mouth ready to swallow him whole. "Please," Joseph begged, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. Whatever I've done, I'm sorry. Don't do this. Think of Father. Think of—" "Father," Judah spat. Always Father's precious Joseph. Well, let's see if Father can hear you from the bottom of this pit." And with that, they threw him in. Joseph fell through darkness, his scream echoing off the stone walls. He hit the bottom, hard pain shooting through his body. For a moment he lay stunned, the breath knocked from his lungs. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the full horror of his situation became clear. The pit was deep, perhaps 20 feet, with smooth walls worn by centuries of water. There was no way to climb out. The bottom was damp and cold, covered in slime and mud. The opening above seemed impossibly far away, a small circle of blue sky that might as well have been the moon. "Brothers!" he cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, let me out. I'll do anything. I'll leave. I'll never come back. Just please don't leave me here." Above, he could hear them talking, but their words were muffled. Then he heard laughter, actual laughter. They were laughing while he was trapped in this living grave. Joseph sank to his knees in the mud, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had happened. The dreams, those glorious dreams that had seemed to promise such a magnificent future, where were they now? Was this God's plan to let him die in a hole in the ground, forgotten and alone? He thought of his father waiting at home for news. How long would Jacob wait before he realized something was wrong? Would he send someone to look for him? Would anyone find him before he died of thirst in this terrible place? Above ground, the brothers sat down to eat their meal, as if nothing had happened. But the bread tasted like ash in their mouths, and the wine was bitter. Joseph's cries from the pit were a constant reminder of what they had done. "Someone shut him up," Simeon said irritably. "Let him cry," Judah replied. "He'll tire eventually." But Reuben could stand it no longer. "I need to check the flocks," he said abruptly, standing up, "the ones in the far pasture." He left quickly, planning to circle back after dark and pull Joseph out. It was a coward's plan, but Reuben was discovering that he was indeed a coward. He could not stand up to his brothers openly, but neither could he be party to murder. As Reuben disappeared over a hill, Judah spotted something else. A caravan approaching from the north. The bells on the camels' harnesses jingled in the desert air, and the distinctive dress of the traders marked them as Ishmaelites, descendants of Abraham through Hagar. They were spice traders, heading down to Egypt with their precious cargo of balm and myrrh. An idea formed in Judah's mind, cold and calculating. "Brothers," he said slowly, "what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." The others considered this. It was actually brilliant. They would be rid of Joseph without the guilt of murder. They would even make some money from it. And Joseph would disappear into the vast slave markets of Egypt, never to be seen again. "How much?" asked Gad practically. They haggled briefly with the traders, who were suspicious, but not overly concerned about the origin of this young slave. Such transactions were common in these lawless lands. Finally, they settled on 20 pieces of silver, the standard price for a young male slave. Joseph was hauled up from the pit, blinking in the sudden sunlight, hope flaring in his chest. Were they releasing him? Had they relented? But his hope turned to fresh horror as he saw the Ishmaelite traders, the ropes in their hands, the coins changing hands between them and his brothers. "No," he screamed. You're selling me your own brother. Please, I beg you, don't do this." He fell to his knees before Judah, clutching at his robes. "Please, brother, I'll be your servant. I'll serve you all my days. Just don't sell me to strangers." Judah kicked him away. "You wanted to be special, Joseph. Congratulations. You're special. You're the only one of us who gets to see Egypt." The Ishmaelites bound Joseph's hands and feet, threw him over a camel like a sack of grain. As the caravan moved off, Joseph twisted around for one last look at his brothers. What he saw in their faces was not hatred anymore, but something worse. Indifference. They had already dismissed him from their minds, erased him from their lives. "Remember me," Joseph cried out, his voice carrying across the desert. "Please, remember me." But they had already turned away, busy with their next task, deciding what to tell their father. When Reuben returned to the pit that evening, planning to rescue Joseph, he found it empty. His cry of anguish echoed across the desert. "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" The others told him what they had done, and Reuben tore his clothes in grief and rage. But what could he do now? The deed was done. Joseph was gone. Together, the brothers concocted their deception. They took Joseph's coat, the hated symbol of favoritism, and slaughtered a goat. They dipped the coat in the blood, tearing it further to make it look like an animal attack. Then they sent it to their father with a message. "We found this. Please identify whether it is your son's coat or not." When Jacob saw the bloodied coat, his cry of anguish could be heard throughout the camp. "It is my son's coat. A wild beast has devoured him." Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. The old man fell to the ground, tearing his clothes, putting on sackcloth, pouring ashes on his head. His grief was terrible to behold. He wept until he had no more tears, then wept dry, racking sobs that shook his entire body. His sons and daughters came to comfort him, the very ones who had caused his grief. They spoke hollow words of consolation, their guilt making them eloquent in their deception. But Jacob would not be comforted. "I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning," he declared. And he meant it. From that day forward, Jacob was a broken man going through the motions of life, but with all joy extinguished. Meanwhile, far away, and getting farther with each passing hour, Joseph bounced along on a camel's back, bound and helpless, traveling toward a land he had never seen, a future he could never have imagined. The coat of many colors was gone, the dreams seemed dead, and the boy, who had been so sure of his destiny, now faced the reality of slavery. But unknown to Joseph, unknown to his brothers, unknown even to Jacob in his grief, the hand of God was moving. What men meant for evil, God was already working for good. The dreams were not dead. They were just beginning. The path to their fulfillment would be longer and darker than anyone could have imagined, but it would lead to a glory greater than even Joseph had dreamed. Part 4. Slave in Egypt. The journey to Egypt was a descent into hell. For days that blurred into nights and nights that bled into days, Joseph endured a torment that stripped away every vestige of his former life. The ropes that bound his wrists cut deep, leaving bloody furrows that attracted flies in the desert heat. His feet, unused to walking such distances, blistered and bled, leaving red footprints in the sand. The Ishmaelite traders were not cruel by the standards of their profession, but neither were they kind. Joseph was merchandise valuable only as long as he could bring a good price in the slave markets of Egypt. They gave him just enough water to keep him alive, just enough food to keep him walking. When he fell, they prodded him with sticks. When he cried out for mercy, they laughed and spoke in a dialect he could barely understand. At night, when they made camp, Joseph would lie on the hard ground, looking up at the stars, the same stars his father had shown him as a child, telling him the stories of Abraham and Isaac. God named these stars, Jacob had said. He knows each one by name, just as he knows you, my son. But now under these same stars, Joseph felt utterly forgotten. If God knew him, why had he allowed this to happen? If God had given him those dreams of greatness, why was he now bound like an animal heading toward a life of slavery? The other slaves in the caravan, for Joseph was not the only human cargo, had already accepted their fate. There was a Nubian woman who had been captured in a raid, her eyes empty of hope. A Canaanite boy younger than Joseph who had been sold by his parents to pay debts. An old man from the north who spoke no language anyone understood, who seemed to have retreated entirely into his own mind. Joseph tried to speak to them to find some comfort in shared misery, but they looked at him with suspicion. His soft hands and refined speech marked him as different. Even among slaves, he was an outsider. As they traveled south, the landscape began to change. The rocky hills of Canaan gave way to endless desert. The heat became oppressive, a living thing that pressed down on them like a weight. Mirages shimmered on the horizon, lakes of water that disappeared as they approached, cities that dissolved into heat waves, promises that turned to dust. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, but was actually 2 weeks, they saw it, Egypt. The first sign was the green, a ribbon of verdant life following the course of the mighty Nile. After days of nothing but sand and rock, the sight of trees and grass and growing things was almost painful in its beauty. Then came the monuments, pyramids rising from the desert like mountains built by the hands of gods, temples with columns so tall they seemed to hold up the sky itself, statues of pharaohs and deities that dwarfed any human scale. Joseph, despite his misery, felt his breath catch. He had heard stories of Egypt's grandeur, but the reality exceeded any description. This was civilization on a scale that made his father's tents seem like children's toys. This was power that made his dreams of his brother's bowing seem petty and small. The slave market in the city of Memphis was a place of organized chaos. Hundreds of slaves stood on platforms, while potential buyers examined them like livestock. Joseph watched in horror as families were separated, children torn from mothers, husbands from wives. The air was filled with a cacophony of languages, pleading, cursing, weeping, praying. When Joseph's turn came, he was made to stand on a wooden platform, while the auctioneer called out his qualities in rapid-fire Egyptian. Young Hebrew male, strong back, good teeth, educated, can read and write, useful for household service or administrative work. The buyers circled him, poking at his muscles, examining his teeth, checking his eyes. Joseph had never felt more like an animal, more stripped of basic human dignity. One of the buyers, a fat merchant, grabbed Joseph's face and turned it roughly from side to side.
"Pretty boy," he said in broken Hebrew, "you'll fetch a good price in certain houses if you understand my meaning."
Joseph's blood ran cold.
He had heard whispers of such things, the fate of comely slaves in pagan households. He began to pray desperately silently to the God who seemed to have abandoned him. It was then that Potiphar arrived. He was impossible to miss, a tall, imposing figure in the regalia of a high Egyptian official. Captain of Pharaoh's guard, someone whispered, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. His presence commanded immediate attention and respect. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea would one day part before Moses. Potiphar's eyes, dark and intelligent, swept over the slaves with the practiced gaze of a man used to judging human potential. When his gaze fell on Joseph, he paused. Something in the young Hebrew's bearing, even in chains, even in degradation, caught his attention. There was a dignity there, a refusal to be broken, an inner light that slavery had not extinguished. "That one," Potiphar said, pointing at Joseph. "How much?" The negotiation was brief. Potiphar didn't haggle. He paid the asking price without question. Joseph was unshackled from the platform and reshackled for transport to his new home. As he was led away, he caught a glimpse of the fat merchant's disappointed face and felt a wave of relief. Whatever awaited him in Potiphar's house, it had to be better than the alternative. Potiphar's estate was a world unto itself, a massive complex of buildings surrounded by high walls. There were gardens with flowers. Joseph had never seen fountains that sparkled in the sunlight, corridors decorated with paintings that told stories of gods and kings. The servants' quarters alone were larger than his father's entire encampment. Joseph was assigned to the household staff, starting with the most menial tasks, carrying water, sweeping floors, tending the gardens. But it quickly became apparent that he was no ordinary slave. He worked with a diligence that surprised even the harsh taskmaster who supervised the servants. He learned Egyptian with remarkable speed, mastering not just the spoken language, but the complex hieroglyphic writing system. More than that, everything Joseph touched seemed to prosper. The section of garden he tended bloomed more luxuriantly than any other. The storerooms he organized became models of efficiency. The accounts he was eventually allowed to help with revealed discrepancies that had been costing the household significant money. Potiphar began to take notice. This Hebrew slave was different. It wasn't just his competence, though, that was remarkable. It was something else, something Potiphar couldn't quite define. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding Joseph's work, blessing everything he did. "Tell me Hebrew," Potiphar said one day, summoning Joseph to his private chamber. "What God do you serve?" Joseph, who had been in Egypt for a year now, had learned to speak carefully. "I serve the God of my fathers, my Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one true God who created heaven and earth." Potiphar studied him. "And this God of yours, he is with you even here in Egypt." "I believe he is my Lord," Joseph replied, though in his heart he still struggled with doubt. If God was with him, why was he a slave? Why had his dreams led to this? "Interesting," Potiphar mused. "Well, your God seems to bring blessing to my house. Continue to serve him and me faithfully." As the months turned to years, Joseph's position in the household steadily rose. He was promoted from laborer to assistant, from assistant to supervisor, from supervisor to overseer. By his 4th year in Potiphar's service, at the age of 21, Joseph was running the entire household. Potiphar had put everything under his authority except what he ate, a religious restriction
based on Egyptian purity laws. The other servants were amused and, in some cases, resentful. An Hebrew slave rising to such heights was unheard of. But Joseph managed them with wisdom and fairness, never forgetting what it was like to be at the bottom, never abusing his authority. Still at night, when the house was quiet, and Joseph lay on his bed, a real bed now, not the floor, he thought of home. He wondered if his father still lived, if he still mourned. He wondered about Benjamin, his little brother. Did he think Joseph was dead? And his other brothers, did they ever feel guilt for what they had done? The dreams still came sometimes, the old dreams of sheaves and stars bowing. But now they seemed like mockery. How could his family bow to him when they thought he was dead? How could he rule over anyone when he was, despite his elevated position, still a slave? Joseph had learned to push these thoughts away, to focus on the present, on doing his duty with excellence. He had learned to find a kind of peace in service, a purpose in bringing order to Potiphar's household. He had even begun to see God's hand in his circumstances, not in the grand dramatic way of his youthful dreams, but in small mercies, daily provisions, the strength to continue. But Joseph's greatest test was yet to come, for while he had caught the eye of Potiphar for his competence and integrity, he had caught another eye as well, the roving, lustful eye of Potiphar's wife. She was beautiful in the way that Egyptian noblewomen cultivated beauty. Painted eyes henna'd, hands elaborate wigs, jewels that caught the light with every movement. She was also bored, neglected by a husband whose duties to Pharaoh kept him away for weeks at a time, surrounded by luxury, but starved for excitement. At first, her interest in Joseph was mere curiosity. Who was this Hebrew slave who had risen so high? What made him special? She would find excuses to be in rooms where he was working, would ask him unnecessary questions about household matters, would let her eyes linger on his form when she thought no one was watching. Joseph was not naive. He recognized the danger immediately. He had seen what happened to slaves who became entangled with their masters' wives. At best, they were sold off. At worst, they were executed in ways that made crucifixion seem merciful. He began to actively avoid her, conducting his business through intermediaries whenever possible, never allowing himself to be alone with her. But Potiphar's wife was not accustomed to being denied anything she wanted.
And what she wanted with increasing desperation was Joseph. The first direct proposition came on a hot afternoon when the house was nearly empty. Potiphar was at the palace, most of the servants were at the market, and Joseph was reviewing accounts in the main hall. She entered wearing a dress that was scandalous, even by Egyptian standards, her perfume preceding her like a herald. "Joseph," she said, her voice low and honeyed, "come lie with me." The words hung in the air like a sword. Joseph's response was immediate and unequivocal. "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. It would be a betrayal of his trust and a sin against the Lord." She laughed, a sound like silver bells with an edge of brass. "Your God, your invisible God, who let you be sold as a slave, you would refuse me for him?" "Yes," Joseph said simply, and left the room. But she did not give up. Day after day, she pursued him. She would appear in his path wearing ever more revealing clothing. She would brush against him accidentally in corridors. She would summon him on false pretenses only to attempt seduction. Each time, Joseph refused. Each time, her frustration grew. The household began to notice the tension. Servants whispered in corners. The air itself seemed charged with danger. Joseph knew it could not continue, but what could he do? To accuse his master's wife would be death. To succumb would be worse than death. It would be the final betrayal of everything he believed in. The climax came on a day when fate, or perhaps divine providence, arranged for the house to be completely empty except for Joseph and Potiphar's wife. She had planned it carefully, sending servants on errands, ensuring her husband would be detained at court. She waited in her chamber, dressed in her finest garments, surrounded by the intoxicating smoke of incense. "Joseph," she called, her voice carrying through the empty halls, "I need you in my chamber. The accounts for the feast must be reviewed." Joseph knew it was a trap, but he was the overseer. He could not refuse a direct order without cause. He entered her chamber with his head down, the scrolls of accounts in his hands, every muscle tense for flight. She was on him in an instant, grabbing his garment with both hands, pulling him toward her bed. "Lie with me," she demanded, her voice now desperate, all pretense of seduction gone. This was raw desire, mixed with the fury of a woman scorned. Joseph's response was pure instinct. He wrenched himself away with such force that his outer garment tore away in her hands. He fled the room, running through the halls like a man pursued by demons, leaving her holding the empty garment, her face transforming from desire to rage. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and Potiphar's wife's fury was hellish indeed. She looked at the garment in her hands and saw not evidence of Joseph's virtue, but a weapon for her revenge. She began to scream, "Help! Help! The Hebrew slave tried to rape me! Help!" Servants came running from all directions, finding their mistress in theatrical distress, holding Joseph's garment, her clothing artfully disheveled. She had her story ready, polished by repetition in her mind. "The Hebrew slave that my husband brought us came to mock me. He came into my chamber and tried to lie with me. When I screamed, he fled, leaving his garment behind. Look, here is the proof." When Potiphar returned that evening, he found his household in uproar and his wife in tears. She told him the same story, adding details, with each telling painting Joseph as an ungrateful villain who had betrayed the kindness shown to him. Potiphar's anger was terrible to behold. The trusted servant, the one he had elevated above all others, had attempted to violate his wife. The betrayal cut deep. But somewhere in the back of his mind a small voice questioned. Joseph had been in his household for years without a hint of impropriety. His wife, on the other hand, but no, he could not think such thoughts. She was his wife. Her word must be believed. Joseph was seized that very hour. There was no trial, no opportunity for defense. In Egypt, the word of a noble woman against a foreign slave was absolute. The sentence should have been death, would have been death. But Potiphar, perhaps harboring doubts, perhaps remembering Joseph's years of faithful service, commuted it to imprisonment. As Joseph was dragged away in chains, he caught a glimpse of Potiphar's wife watching from a window. There was no triumph in her face, only a hollow emptiness. She had destroyed the one thing she wanted because she could not have it. It was a Pyrrhic victory that would haunt her for the rest of her days.
Joseph was taken to the royal prison, a dungeon reserved for political prisoners and those who had offended Pharaoh's household. As the bronze doors clanged shut behind him, as darkness enveloped him, once again, Joseph fell to his knees. "My God," he cried out, "why, I honored you. I refused sin, even when it would have been easy. Even when no one would have known, I kept myself pure. And this is my reward, prison again." The dreams seemed more distant than ever now. He had gone from favored son to slave, from slave to trusted overseer, from overseer to prisoner. Each time he rose, he fell further. Was this the pattern of his life? To almost grasp success only to have it torn away. But even in the depths of his despair, even in the darkness of the dungeon, something within Joseph refused to break. The same God who had been with him in Potiphar's house would be with him in prison. He had to believe that. He had to hold on to faith, even when faith seemed foolish. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness of his cell, Joseph noticed other prisoners watching him. They had heard of him, the Hebrew who had run Potiphar's household, brought down by a woman's accusation. Some looked at him with pity, others with curiosity, a few with respect. Here was a man who had chosen principle over pleasure, integrity over ease. The keeper of the prison, a gruff Egyptian named Canaan, approached Joseph's cell. "So, you're the Hebrew who couldn't keep his hands to himself," he said. But there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't quite believe it. "I am innocent," Joseph said simply. Canaan studied him for a long moment. He had been a prison keeper for 20 years. He had seen guilty men proclaim innocence, and innocent men confess to crimes they didn't commit. But something about this Hebrew was different. "Innocent or guilty, you're here now," Canaan said. "Make the best of it." And Joseph did. Just as he had in Potiphar's house, he began with the smallest tasks, helping weaker prisoners, organizing the meager supplies, teaching those who wanted to learn to read and write. Slowly, inevitably, the same blessing that had followed him in Potiphar's house began to manifest in prison. The keeper of the prison began to notice that sections under Joseph's care ran more smoothly. Disputes between prisoners were resolved more peacefully when Joseph mediated. Even the food seemed to go further when Joseph helped with distribution. Within a year, Canaan had put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. It was an unprecedented position for an inmate, but Canaan had learned what Potiphar had learned. Everything Joseph touched prospered. The prison ran better with Joseph managing it than it ever had before. Still, Joseph was a prisoner. The walls were still walls, the chains still chains, even if they were now more figurative than literal. He had exchanged one form of bondage for another, and the dreams of his youth seemed like fantasies from another lifetime. Part 5. The Interpreter of Dreams. 2 years passed in the dungeon. 2 years of darkness punctuated by slivers of light through barred windows. 2 years of the same stone walls, the same meager meals, the same hopeless faces of fellow prisoners. Joseph had learned to find God in the darkness, to worship in the depths, to maintain hope when hope seemed foolish. He had developed a routine that kept him sane, morning prayers reciting the stories his father had told him about Abraham and Isaac, about God's faithfulness to his people. Then work, managing the prison, mediating disputes, caring for the sick and elderly inmates. Evening prayers looking through the small window at the stars, the same stars that had witnessed his dreams so long ago. The other prisoners had come to respect and even love him. He was the one who ensured fair distribution of food, who stood up to cruel guards, who brought a measure of humanity to an inhuman place. They called him the Hebrew Prince, not knowing how close to the truth they were. Then one day, everything changed. The bronze doors of the prison groaned open, and 2 new prisoners were brought in. But these were not ordinary criminals. Their fine linen clothes, though now disheveled, marked them as palace servants. More than that, they were personal attendants to Pharaoh himself. The first was Amenhotep, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, responsible for tasting all of Pharaoh's wine to ensure it wasn't poisoned, a position of enormous trust and intimacy. The second was Kahotep, Pharaoh's chief baker, who oversaw all the food preparation for the royal household. The prison was abuzz with speculation. What could these 2 have done to earn Pharaoh's wrath? Attempted poisoning? Theft? Conspiracy? No one knew for certain, but their presence in the royal prison meant they had somehow offended the God-King himself. Joseph, as overseer, ensured they were given cells befitting their former status. Still prison cells, but cleaner and more spacious than most. He brought them food and water, speaking kindly to them despite their initial haughtiness. Days turned to weeks, and the 2 officials gradually accepted their situation. They began to talk to Joseph, finding in him an educated and sympathetic ear. He was, after all, not the typical prisoner. His Hebrew was cultured, his Egyptian flawless, his knowledge of court protocols surprising for a foreign slave. Then came the morning that would change everything. Joseph entered the section where the cupbearer and baker were held, and immediately noticed something was wrong. Both men sat in their cells with expressions of profound disturbance, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked with genuine concern. The cupbearer spoke first, his voice trembling. "We have both dreamed dreams in the night, and there is no interpreter here. In the palace there would be magicians and wise men to tell us what the dreams mean. But here," he gestured helplessly at the stone walls. Joseph felt something stir within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, the presence of the Spirit of God moving in his heart. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" he said. "Tell me your dreams." The cupbearer and baker exchanged glances. There was something in Joseph's voice and authority that seemed to come from beyond himself. The cupbearer decided to speak first. "In my dream," he began, "I saw a vine before me. On the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." As the cupbearer spoke, Joseph felt understanding flood his mind. It was as clear as if God himself were whispering the meaning in his ear. The feeling was both foreign and familiar. It had been so long since he had experienced the divine clarity that had once characterized his own dreams. "This is the interpretation," Joseph said with quiet confidence. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." The cupbearer's face lit up with hope, the first real hope he had felt since his imprisonment.
But Joseph wasn't finished. "But when all goes well with you," Joseph continued, his voice taking on a note of desperate pleading, "remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." It was the first time in years that Joseph had spoken of his innocence, the first time he had asked for help. The cupbearer nodded eagerly, promising to remember his interpreter when he was restored. The baker, seeing the favorable interpretation given to his colleague, eagerly shared his own dream. "I too had a dream," he said. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph's face grew grave. The interpretation that came to him this time was dark, terrible. For a moment he hesitated. Should he speak the truth? But he knew he must. The interpretation was from God, and he was merely the messenger. "This is the interpretation," Joseph said slowly, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh." The baker's face went white. He began to protest, to argue, but something in Joseph's eyes stopped him. This was not malice or cruelty. This was truth terrible and inescapable. 3 days. They had 3 days to wait to see if Joseph's interpretations were correct. Those 3 days were the longest in recent memory. The entire prison watched and waited. If Joseph was right, it would be remarkable. If he was wrong, he would lose all credibility. The cupbearer oscillated between hope and doubt. The baker grew increasingly desperate, praying to every Egyptian god he knew, making promises, bargaining for his life. On the 3rd day the prison doors opened. Guards entered with royal decree. It was Pharaoh's birthday, and he was granting amnesty to some prisoners. The cupbearer was released, restored to his position with full honors. The baker was taken away to be executed, just as Joseph had foretold. As the cupbearer was led away, Joseph called out to him one last time, "Remember me, please, remember me." The cupbearer nodded and smiled, full of gratitude and promises. Surely he would remember. Surely he would speak to Pharaoh about the remarkable Hebrew who had interpreted his dream. Surely Joseph's deliverance was at hand. But days turned to weeks, weeks to months, months to years. The cupbearer, restored to his comfortable position, surrounded by luxury and privilege, forgot. Or perhaps he didn't forget, but chose not to remember. Speaking of his time in prison might remind Pharaoh of whatever offense had sent him there. Better to let sleeping dogs lie. Better to enjoy his restored status without complications. Joseph waited. Every time the prison doors opened, his heart leaped. Every time a guard approached his cell, he wondered if this was the moment. But the moment never came. 2 full years passed. 2 years of crushing disappointment added to all his other years of suffering. Joseph was now 30 years old. 13 years had passed since his brothers sold him into slavery. 13 years of bondage in one form or another. The dreams of his youth seemed like cruel jokes now. His brothers bowing to him. He would be lucky if he ever saw sunlight again as a free man. The God who had given him those dreams, who had sustained him through slavery and false accusation, seemed to have abandoned him to rot in this dungeon. Yet still Joseph continued to serve. He continued to manage the prison with integrity. He continued to pray, though his prayers were now less about deliverance and more about endurance. He had learned to find purpose in his present circumstances rather than constantly longing for a different future. But God had not forgotten Joseph. The dreams were not dead. They were about to explode into reality in a way that would shake the foundations of the ancient world. For in the palace above, Pharaoh was about to have dreams of his own, dreams that all the magicians and wise men of Egypt could not interpret, dreams that would require a Hebrew prisoner to unlock their meaning, dreams that would elevate Joseph from the dungeon to the throne in a single day. The cupbearer's forgetfulness was not a mistake in God's plan. It was part of it. For if Joseph had been released 2 years earlier, he would not have been in position when Pharaoh needed him most. God's timing, as always, was perfect, even when it seemed like cruel delay to those waiting in the darkness. Part 6. Pharaoh's Nightmares. The night was oppressive in the royal palace of Egypt. The great Pharaoh, considered a god by his people, tossed restlessly on his bed of gold and ivory. The finest linen sheets woven with threads of silver were soaked with sweat. The cooling fans, operated by slaves, did nothing to ease the fever that seemed to burn from within. And then the dreams came. Pharaoh stood by the Nile, the great river that was the lifeblood of Egypt. The waters flowed as they always had, brown with rich silt bordered by papyrus and lotus. But then, from the sacred waters, 7 cows emerged. These were not ordinary cows. They were magnificent, their hides gleaming, their bodies fat with health, their eyes bright with vitality. They began to graze among the reeds, peaceful and content. But then, horror! 7 more cows emerged from the same river, but these were abominations. Gaunt to the point of being skeletal, their ribs showing through diseased hide, their eyes hollow with famine. They stood beside the healthy cows on the riverbank, and then, impossibly terribly, they opened their mouths and devoured the 7 healthy cows, swallowed them whole as if they were no more than blades of grass. Yet after consuming the healthy cows, the gaunt cows remained as skeletal as before. They stood there, death incarnate, staring at Pharaoh with their hollow eyes. Pharaoh woke with a scream that brought guards running. But when they found no assassin, no threat, he dismissed them. It was just a dream, just a nightmare brought on by something he ate, perhaps, or the stress of ruling an empire. He fell back into uneasy sleep, and immediately another dream seized him. This time he saw a single stalk of grain growing by the Nile. From this stalk sprouted 7 heads of grain, full and golden, heavy, with kernels beautiful to behold. This was the grain that fed all of Egypt, the harvest that made his kingdom the granary of the ancient world. But then, from the same stalk, 7 more heads of grain sprouted. These were thin, scorched by the east wind, withered and useless. And just as with the cows, these 7 thin heads swallowed the 7 good heads, consuming them entirely, leaving nothing behind but emptiness. Pharaoh woke again, and this time he did not try to return to sleep. He sat on his bed, trembling, as dawn broke over Memphis. These were not ordinary dreams. In Egypt, dreams were messages from the gods, and dreams of the Pharaoh were matters of national importance. But what did they mean? What were the gods trying to tell him? As soon as the sun rose, Pharaoh summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt.
They came in their elaborate robes carrying their scrolls and amulets, their heads shaved and gleaming with sacred oils. These were men who claimed to understand the mysteries of the universe, who could read the future in the stars and the entrails of birds. Pharaoh related his dreams to them, every detail, every nuance. They listened with grave attention, consulted their scrolls, performed their divinations, but as the hours passed, their confidence waned. They proposed interpretation after interpretation, each more far-fetched than the last. The 7 cows represent 7 provinces that will rebel and be subdued. No, they represent 7 years of war, followed by 7 years of peace. The grain represents your children. 7 will live and 7 will die. Nonsense. The grain represents the 7 gods of the harvest, blessing and cursing in turn. Pharaoh grew increasingly frustrated. These interpretations felt wrong, hollow manufactured. These learned men, for all their supposed wisdom, were grasping at straws. The dreams meant something specific, something crucial, and no one could tell him what. It was then, in the midst of this confusion and frustration, that the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Joseph, the Hebrew prisoner who had interpreted his dream with perfect accuracy 2 years ago. How could he have forgotten? The cupbearer fell to his knees before Pharaoh. "O great Pharaoh, may you live forever. I remember my faults today." When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and imprisoned me with the chief baker, we both had dreams on the same night, each dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the baker was hanged. Pharaoh's response was immediate. "Bring me this Hebrew, now." The orders went out with the speed that only royal command could inspire. Guards ran to the prison. Kayamwasit, the keeper, was roused and ordered to produce Joseph immediately. There was no time for preparation, no time for explanation. Joseph was dragged from his cell, blinking in the sudden sunlight. He was hastily washed, his beard shaved in the Egyptian fashion, given clean clothes to replace his prison rags. It all happened so fast that he barely had time to process what was occurring. One moment he was a forgotten prisoner. The next he was being rushed through the streets of Memphis toward the palace. The throne room of Pharaoh was a wonder that defied description. Columns rose like giant trees, their capitals painted with gold and lapis lazuli. The walls were covered with hieroglyphs telling the glorious history of Egypt. Statues of gods and past pharaohs watched with stone eyes. And there, at the far end, on a throne that seemed to touch the heavens, sat Pharaoh himself. Joseph had seen powerful men before, Potiphar, various nobles and officials, but Pharaoh was different. This was a man who commanded the mightiest nation on earth, who was worshipped as a god, whose word could bring life or death to millions. Joseph fell to his face, prostrating himself completely. "Rise," Pharaoh commanded, and Joseph stood, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "I have had dreams," Pharaoh said without preamble, "and no one can interpret them. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed both his humility and his faith. "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer."
Pharaoh studied this Hebrew slave with interest. There was something different about him, something that set him apart from the cowering prisoners he occasionally had brought before him. There was a dignity here, a quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from faith. Pharaoh related his dreams again, adding even more detail than before. The expression on the cows' faces, the sound of the wind in the grain, the horror he felt watching the consumption. Joseph listened intently, and as he did, the Spirit of God moved upon him as it had not done in years. The meaning of the dreams became crystal clear, as obvious as if it were written in letters of fire. When Pharaoh finished, Joseph spoke, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads of grain scorched by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine will deplete the land. The plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. The throne room was silent. Everyone present, nobles, priests, guards, scribes, held their breath. This Hebrew slave had just delivered a prophecy of catastrophe, 7 years of famine following 7 years of plenty. It would be the greatest disaster in Egypt's history. But Joseph wasn't finished. He had not only interpreted the dream, but now offered counsel with the boldness of a trusted adviser. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. The audacity of it was breathtaking. A Hebrew slave pulled from prison moments ago was now advising the God King of Egypt on national policy. The court waited for Pharaoh's wrath to fall. But Pharaoh sat back on his throne, his eyes wide with recognition. This was it. This was the truth his soul had recognized, but his mind couldn't grasp. The interpretation rang with such clarity, such obvious correctness, that he wondered how his magicians had missed it. And the advice, it was brilliant in its simplicity. Save during the plenty to survive the famine. Pharaoh turned to his advisers. Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then, turning back to Joseph, Pharaoh made a declaration that would have seemed impossible just moments before. Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute.
Pharaoh removed his signet ring, the symbol of royal authority, and placed it on Joseph's finger. Servants rushed forward with fine linen garments to replace his hastily donned clothes. A gold chain was placed around his neck. He was given the second chariot, and as he rode through the streets, heralds cried out, "Bow the knee!" Joseph's mind reeled. This morning he had awakened in a dungeon. Now he was the second most powerful man in the world's mightiest empire. The dreams of his youth suddenly didn't seem so impossible anymore. If God could elevate him from prison to palace in a single day, what else might he do? Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphnath-Paneah, meaning God speaks and he lives, or revealer of secrets. He also gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. This was not just a marriage, but a political alliance that would give Joseph legitimacy in Egyptian society. The foreign slave was being woven into the very fabric of Egyptian nobility. Joseph stood in his new palace that night, looking out over the city of Memphis. The Nile flowed below silver in the moonlight. The pyramids rose in the distance, eternal and mysterious. He thought of his father, probably still mourning him as dead. He thought of his brothers who had sold him to get rid of his dreams. He thought of Potiphar's wife whose lies had sent him to prison. He thought of the cupbearer whose forgetfulness had cost him 2 extra years in the dungeon. Each betrayal, each setback, each moment of despair had been a thread in a tapestry he couldn't see while he was living it. But now, standing here with all of Egypt spread before him, he began to understand. God had not abandoned him. God had been preparing him. The 7 years of plenty began almost immediately. The harvests were beyond anything Egypt had ever seen. The Nile flooded perfectly, depositing rich silt across the farmlands. The grain grew tall and golden. The fruit trees bent under the weight of their produce. The vines produced grapes in clusters so large they had to be carried by 2 men. Joseph threw himself into his work with the same diligence he had shown as a slave and prisoner. He traveled throughout Egypt, establishing storage cities, building granaries, developing a distribution system that had never been attempted on such a scale. He appointed overseers who were trustworthy and capable, created accounting systems to track every bushel of grain, every jar of oil. 1/5 of all produce was collected just as he had advised. At first, the people grumbled. Why should they give up their bounty when times were so good? But Joseph's authority, backed by Pharaoh's decree, was absolute. The grain was collected, stored, preserved. The storage facilities were marvels of engineering. Joseph employed techniques he had learned from various sources: Hebrew knowledge passed down from his fathers, Egyptian architectural wisdom, even things he had picked up from fellow prisoners from distant lands. The grain was kept dry, protected from rodents and rot, carefully managed to prevent spoilage. During these years of plenty, Asenath bore Joseph 2 sons. The first he named Manasseh, meaning, God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, meaning, God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. In these names was Joseph's theology. God could bring forgetting of pain and fruitfulness from suffering. As the 7th year of plenty drew to a close, Joseph noticed the signs. The Nile's flood was slightly less than the year before. The harvest, while still good, was not as bountiful. The insects were different, the wind patterns changing. He doubled his efforts at collection and storage, knowing what was coming. And then it began. The 7 years of famine. The Nile failed to flood properly. The minimal water that did come was insufficient to irrigate the fields. The seeds that were planted withered in the ground. The sun beat down mercilessly on land that turned to dust. The green fields of Egypt became brown wastelands. At first the Egyptians relied on their personal stores. Surely this was just a bad year. Surely the next flood would be better. But when the second year was worse than the first, panic began to set in. The people cried to Pharaoh for bread. "Go to Joseph," Pharaoh told them. "Whatever he says to you, do it." Joseph opened the storehouses and began to sell grain to the Egyptians. The distribution system he had designed worked flawlessly. Each city had its storehouse. Each storehouse had its overseer. Each citizen received their allocation based on careful calculation of need and supply. There was no chaos, no rioting, no starvation. Egypt alone among the nations was prepared. But the famine was not limited to Egypt. It spread across the ancient world like a plague. Canaan, Syria, Mesopotamia, all felt the devastating hand of drought. The trade routes that usually brought goods to Egypt now brought desperate people seeking food. Joseph sold grain to these foreigners too, but at higher prices. Egypt's survival came first, but there was enough to help others for a price. Gold, silver, jewels, and other valuables flowed into Egypt's treasuries. The nation that should have been destroyed by the famine was instead becoming wealthier and more powerful than ever. It was in the second year of the famine that Joseph, standing at the distribution center, overseeing the sale of grain to foreign buyers, saw something that made his heart stop. A group of 10 men dressed in the style of Canaanite shepherds approaching with their heads bowed and their money pouches ready. His brothers. 20 years had passed since they sold him into slavery. They were older now, their beards gray, their faces lined with years of sun and hardship. But Joseph knew them instantly. Reuben, still trying to carry himself with the authority of the firstborn. Judah, natural leadership evident in his bearing. Simeon and Levi still walking like warriors, despite their age. All of them except Benjamin was not there. Joseph's Egyptian appearance, his shaved head, his fine linen clothes, his gold chains, his position of authority, made him unrecognizable to them. How could they imagine that the brother they sold as a 17-year-old slave was now the Lord of Egypt? They approached and bowed low before him, their faces to the ground. And in that moment, Joseph remembered his dreams. The 11 sheaves bowing to his sheaf. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing to him. Here were 10 of those stars prostrating themselves before him, begging for grain. Joseph's emotions were a tempest. Part of him wanted to embrace them, to weep, to tell them who he was. Part of him, burned with old anger, wanted to revenge himself for their cruelty. Part of him was curious. Had they changed? Did they regret what they had done? And where was Benjamin? He spoke to them harshly through an interpreter, though he understood every word they said in Hebrew. "Where do you come from?" "From the land of Canaan to buy food," they replied, keeping their heads low. "You are spies," Joseph accused. "You have come to see the nakedness of the land."
They protested vehemently, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." "No," Joseph insisted, "you have come to see the nakedness of the land." Desperately, they began to explain themselves. "Your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. The youngest is with our father today, and one is no more." One is no more. They still believed he was dead, and Benjamin, alive, safe, but not here. Why was Jacob protecting him, afraid to lose Rachel's last remaining son? Joseph made a show of considering. "This is how you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you." He had them all imprisoned for 3 days, 3 days to think, to worry, to wonder at their fate. 3 days for Joseph to decide what to do with this unexpected gift of power over those who had once held power over him. On the 3rd day, Joseph had them brought before him again. His plan was formed, complex and subtle, designed to test their characters while protecting Benjamin. "Do this and live, for I fear God," he said, not realizing how much that phrase would mean to his brothers. An Egyptian who feared God. "If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to prison, but you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die." The brothers looked at each other in dismay. Then, speaking in Hebrew, assuming the Egyptian lord couldn't understand them, they began to reveal their guilty consciences. "We are truly guilty concerning our brother," Reuben said, his voice heavy with a remorse 20 years in the making. "We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us." "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy?" Reuben continued. "But you would not listen. Now his blood is required of us." Joseph had to turn away from them, ostensibly to speak to an aide, but really to hide the tears streaming down his face. They did remember. They did feel guilt. The years had not erased their crime from their consciences. When he had composed himself, Joseph turned back. He had Simeon bound before their eyes, Simeon, who had been one of the cruelest that day, by the pit. The others would go home, but Simeon would remain as surety for their return. Joseph then gave secret orders to his servants. The brothers' sacks were to be filled with grain, but their money was to be secretly returned, placed in the mouth of each sack. He also ordered that they be given provisions for their journey. It was a test within a test. How would they react when they found the money? The 9 brothers left, driving their donkeys laden with grain, their hearts heavy with confusion and fear. Who was this Egyptian lord who seemed to know them so well? Why had he accused them of being spies? What would they tell their father about Simeon and the demand to bring Benjamin? That night when they stopped at an inn and one opened his sack to feed his donkey, he found his money returned. "My money has been restored," he cried out to his brothers. "Here it is in my sack." Their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another. "What is this that God has done to us?" When they reached Canaan and told Jacob all that had happened, the old man's grief was terrible to behold. "Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin? All these things are against me." Reuben, trying to take responsibility at last, made a desperate offer.
Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring Benjamin back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back." But Jacob was adamant. "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him on the journey, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave." Part 7. The testing of hearts. The famine deepened its grip on the land. The grain the brothers had brought from Egypt was consumed all too quickly, and the specter of starvation loomed over Jacob's household. The old patriarch, who had resisted so fiercely, finally had to face reality. "Go back," he said to his sons, his voice heavy with resignation. "Buy us a little food." But Judah, who had emerged as the spokesman, was firm. "The man solemnly warned us, saying, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send Benjamin with us, we will go down and buy food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down.' For the man said to us, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" Jacob's anguish burst forth. "Why did you deal so wrongfully with me as to tell the man whether you had still another brother?" The brothers explained that the Egyptian lord had questioned them closely about their family. They couldn't have known he would make such a demand. The argument went back and forth, but finally Judah made an oath that would prove prophetic. "I myself will be surety for him. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever." This was a different Judah from the one who had sold Joseph 20 years ago. This was a man who had learned the weight of responsibility, the cost of loss. His own story, the death of his sons, the incident with Tamar, had taught him about judgment and mercy, about the complexities of human failure and divine justice. Jacob finally relented. "If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best fruits of the land in your vessels and carry down a present for the man. A little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double money in your hand and take back the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take your brother also, and arise, go back to the man." Then the old man prayed a prayer that revealed both his faith and his desperation. "And may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may release your other brother and Benjamin. If I am bereaved, I am bereaved." The journey to Egypt was tense. Benjamin, now a young man but still the protected youngest, was experiencing the world beyond his father's tents for the first time. His brothers formed a protective circle around him, determined that no harm would come to Rachel's last son. They carried their gifts and double money, rehearsing what they would say about the returned silver. When they arrived in Egypt and presented themselves at the grain distribution center, Joseph saw them immediately. His eyes locked onto Benjamin, his full brother, his mother's son, now grown into manhood. The emotion that welled up in him was almost overwhelming, but he maintained his composure. "Bring these men to my house," he instructed his steward. "Slaughter an animal, and make ready, for these men will dine with me at noon." The brothers were terrified when they were taken to Joseph's house. "It is because of the money that was returned in our sacks the first time," they said to one another. "We are brought in that he may make a case against us and seize us to take us as slaves with our donkeys." They approached Joseph's steward at the entrance to the house, explaining about the money, offering to return it, along with the additional money they had brought. The steward's response puzzled them. "Peace be with you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money." Then Simeon was brought out to them, released from his imprisonment. He was thin but unharmed, and the reunion was emotional. The brothers were given water to wash their feet and fodder for their donkeys. They prepared their gifts, waiting nervously for this mysterious Egyptian lord who seemed to hold their fate in his hands. When Joseph arrived home at noon, they presented their gifts and bowed down before him to the earth. Again the dreams were being fulfilled, but the victory felt hollow to Joseph. These were not subjects bowing to a king, but desperate men trying to save their families. Joseph inquired about their welfare, his voice carefully neutral through the interpreter. "Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" "Your servant, our father, is in good health. He is still alive," they answered, bowing down again in respect. Then Joseph's eyes fell on Benjamin, and he could barely maintain his composure. "Is this your younger brother, of whom you spoke to me?" Without waiting for an answer, he said to Benjamin, "God be gracious to you, my son." The use of "my son" was unusual. Benjamin was not that much younger than the supposed Egyptian lord. But before anyone could question it, Joseph hurried from the room. He fled to his private chamber where he wept. Great gasping sobs that released 20 years of longing pain and now joy at seeing his beloved brother again. When he had washed his face and regained control, he returned and ordered the meal to be served. The seating arrangement was curious. The Egyptians ate by themselves for religious reasons. They would not eat with Hebrews. Joseph ate by himself, his status requiring separation, and the 11 brothers ate by themselves. But they were seated in perfect order of their birth from firstborn to youngest. The brothers looked at one another in astonishment. How could this Egyptian know their birth order? The mysteries were multiplying, making them increasingly uneasy. As the meal progressed, Joseph sent portions from his table to theirs, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger than any of the others. Joseph watched carefully. Would they show jealousy toward Benjamin as they had toward him? Would they resent this favoritism? But the brothers showed no resentment. They seemed genuinely happy that Benjamin was honored, protective even. They had changed, or at least they had learned to hide their jealousy better. Joseph needed to test them further. That night, Joseph instructed his steward in the final test. "Fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack. Also, put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with his grain money." The silver cup was not just any cup. It was Joseph's divination cup, a symbol of his authority and power in Egypt. Its theft would be considered not just a crime, but sacrilege punishable by death or permanent enslavement. The next morning, the brothers left early, their hearts light. They had succeeded. They had their grain. Simeon was free. Benjamin was safe, and they were heading home. The strange Egyptian lord had been generous, even kind. Perhaps their troubles were over. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph's steward overtook them, accompanied by guards. His accusation was sharp and shocking. "Why have you repaid evil for good? Is this not the cup from which my lord drinks, and by which he practices divination? You have done evil in what you have done." The brothers were indignant in their innocence. "Why does my lord say these words? Far be it from us that your servants should do such a thing."
The money we found in our sacks we brought back to you from Canaan. How then could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house, with whomever of your servants it is found? Let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves." They were so confident in their innocence that they made this rash vow, not knowing they were echoing their father's similar vow years ago, when Laban accused him of stealing his household gods, a vow that had unknowingly condemned Rachel to death. The steward modified their terms, "Only he with whom it is found shall be my slave, and you shall be blameless." Each man quickly lowered his sack to the ground and opened it. The steward searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest. The cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers tore their clothes in anguish and despair. This was a nightmare beyond imagining. Benjamin, innocent Benjamin, whom they had sworn to protect, would be enslaved. How could this have happened? But instead of abandoning Benjamin to his fate, as they had once abandoned Joseph, they all returned to the city. They would face this together. They would not leave their brother behind. When they arrived at Joseph's house, he was still there as if waiting for them. They fell to the ground before him, and Judah spoke for them all. "What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? How shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my Lord's slaves, both we and he also, with whom the cup was found." The reference to God finding out their iniquity was telling. They were thinking not just of the cup, but of their treatment of Joseph all those years ago. This felt like divine justice finally catching up with them. But Joseph continued the test. "Far be it from me that I should do so. The man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." This was the crucial moment. They could leave Benjamin and save themselves. It would be so easy to rationalize. Benjamin had somehow taken the cup, he must face the consequences. They had families of their own to think about. Jacob would grieve, but he would survive. But Judah stepped forward. What followed was one of the most eloquent and moving speeches in all of Scripture, a plea that revealed how completely he had been transformed from the man who had sold his brother for 20 pieces of silver. "Oh, my Lord," Judah began, "please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's hearing, and do not let your anger burn against your servant, for you are even like Pharaoh himself." Judah recounted the whole story. Their first visit, the demand to bring Benjamin, their father's anguish, his own personal guarantee of Benjamin's safety. He painted a picture of Jacob's grief over Joseph's loss and his terror of losing Benjamin. "Now when I come to your servant, my father and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life. It will happen when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. So your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant, our father, with sorrow to the grave." Then came the climax of Judah's plea, an offer that showed complete transformation. "Now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father?" Judah, who had proposed selling Joseph, now offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place. The man who had been willing to profit from his brother's misery was now willing to suffer for his brother's freedom. The transformation was complete. Part 8. The Revelation.
Joseph could bear it no longer. The test was complete. His brothers had passed. They were not the same men who had thrown him into the pit 22 years ago. They had learned love, sacrifice, responsibility. Judah's offer to take Benjamin's place was proof that they had truly changed. "Make everyone go out from me," Joseph commanded in Egyptian. The servants, guards, and attendants quickly left the room. The 11 brothers stood alone, confused and frightened, before this powerful Egyptian lord who seemed about to pronounce judgment. When the room was empty, Joseph could no longer control himself. The tears came first, then the sobs. Great wrenching cries that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The brothers stood frozen, terrified. Was this grief, rage, madness? Then through his tears, Joseph spoke, but not in Egyptian, through an interpreter, in perfect Hebrew, in the accent of their childhood, in a voice they had not heard for over 2 decades. "I am Joseph." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. The brothers stared, unable to process what they had heard. It was impossible. Joseph was dead. Joseph had been sold to Ishmaelites. Joseph could not be this powerful Egyptian lord. "Is my father still alive?" Joseph asked, moving toward them. But the brothers couldn't answer. They were dismayed, terrified, overwhelmed. If this was Joseph, if their brother was the second most powerful man in Egypt, then they were doomed. He had tested them, manipulated them, held their lives in his hands. Now would come the revenge. They backed away from him, but Joseph called out, his voice breaking with emotion, "Please come near to me." Slowly trembling, they approached. Joseph pulled back his Egyptian headdress, and despite the years, despite the Egyptian styling, they could see it. The face of their brother older, lined with experience, but unmistakably Joseph. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." The confirmation of their worst fear and most impossible hope. Joseph lived. Joseph ruled. Joseph had the power to destroy them utterly. But instead of words of vengeance, Joseph spoke words of grace. "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." This was theology of the highest order. Joseph was reframing their crime as God's providence. He was not excusing what they had done. It was still evil. But God had taken their evil and transformed it into salvation, not just for Egypt, but for the very family that had rejected him. Joseph continued, his words tumbling out in his eagerness to reconcile, to restore, to rebuild what had been broken. "Hurry and go up to my father, and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine.'" Then Joseph fell on Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. The 2 sons of Rachel, separated since childhood, clung to each other. Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept over them. The walls of hatred, fear, and guilt that had stood for over 2 decades crumbled in a flood of tears and embraces. Finally, after the emotional storm had passed, the brothers were able to talk to him. The questions poured out. How had he survived? How had he risen to such power? Did he have a family? The afternoon passed in a blur of stories, explanations, wonder. When news reached Pharaoh that Joseph's brothers had come, he was pleased. This mysterious Hebrew who had saved Egypt had family, had roots, had people. Pharaoh issued a royal decree. Bring your father and your households, and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Take carts from Egypt for your little ones and your wives. Bring your father and come. Do not be concerned about your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Joseph gave his brothers carts as Pharaoh had commanded, and he gave them provisions for the journey. To each he gave changes of clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothing. The favoritism was still there, but now the brothers understood it differently. This was not rejection of them, but special love for the only other son of Rachel. To his father Joseph sent 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and food for the journey. It was a caravan of proof, evidence that the impossible was true.
As his brothers prepared to leave, Joseph gave them one final instruction, revealing his understanding of human nature. See that you do not become troubled along the way. He knew them well. He knew that once the initial joy passed, the recriminations would begin. Who was most at fault? Who had suggested selling him? Who had failed to stop it? The journey home could become a bitter feast of blame and guilt. Joseph was telling them to let it go, to move forward, not backward. The journey back to Canaan was surreal for the brothers. They were traveling the same route they had taken months ago in desperation, but now they traveled in triumph. They carried not just grain, but an invitation to salvation. Their brother, whom they had tried to destroy, had become their deliverer. When they arrived in Canaan and stood before Jacob, the old man listened to their story with increasing disbelief. Joseph is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt.
Jacob's heart stood still. He literally didn't believe them. It was too much, too impossible. The son he had mourned for 22 years was alive, not just alive, but ruler of Egypt. But then they told him all the words Joseph had said to them. The details only Joseph would know. And when Jacob saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him the physical proof of the impossible truth, the spirit of Jacob revived. It is enough, Israel said, for now he was Israel again, not just grieving Jacob. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. The preparation for the journey was massive. This was not just a family visiting a relative, but an entire clan, 70 people in all, relocating to a foreign land. They took their flocks, their herds, their possessions accumulated over generations. As they traveled south, God appeared to Israel in a vision at Beersheba, the last stop before leaving the Promised Land. This was crucial. Abraham had been told not to go to Egypt during a famine. Was Israel about to make a terrible mistake? But God said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. This was divine confirmation. The descent to Egypt was not abandonment of the promise, but part of its fulfillment. In Egypt, protected and provided for the family, would become a nation. The 70 who went down would become millions who would come up. The reunion between Joseph and his father was one of the most emotional scenes in all of Scripture. Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet Israel. When he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Israel's words were perfect in their simplicity. "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive." But Jacob would not die yet. He would live another 17 years in Egypt, long enough to see his family flourish, to meet his Egyptian grandsons, to bless the next generation. The man who had said, "All these things are against me," lived to see how all things had worked together for good. Joseph presented his father and 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh. When Pharaoh asked Jacob his age, the old man replied, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life." Even in his joy at reunion, Jacob remembered the sorrows, the deception of Laban, the loss of Rachel, the presumed death of Joseph, the years of grief. But now at the end, there was restoration. The family settled in Goshen, the best pasture land in Egypt, separate enough to maintain their identity as Hebrews, but close enough to be under Joseph's protection. There they prospered and multiplied even as the famine continued to devastate the rest of the ancient world. Now, Part 9, The Greater Purpose. As the famine continued year after year, Joseph's administrative genius revealed itself fully. He managed not just the distribution of grain, but the complete transformation of Egyptian society. When the people ran out of money, he accepted their livestock in payment. When they ran out of livestock, they sold their land. Finally, they sold themselves, becoming servants to Pharaoh. This might seem harsh, but Joseph was saving their lives. The alternative was starvation. Moreover, he instituted a system where the people would farm the land and give 1/5 to Pharaoh, essentially creating the world's first sustainable tax system. The people were grateful, saying, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." Meanwhile, in Goshen, the children of Israel flourished. They maintained their distinct identity, their worship of the one true God, their customs and traditions. They were in Egypt, but not of Egypt preserved for a purpose they did not yet fully understand. As Jacob's health began to fail, he called Joseph to him with a special request. "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." This was more than sentiment. Jacob understood that Egypt was not their permanent home. The family tomb in Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah Isaac and Rebekah and Leah were buried, was a stake in the promised land, a declaration that they would return. Joseph swore to fulfill his father's request, but Jacob wasn't finished. "Bring your sons to me," he said, "that I may bless them." When Joseph brought Manasseh and Ephraim to his father, Jacob did something unexpected. He crossed his hands, placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, the younger, and his left on Manasseh's head, the older. Joseph tried to correct him, but Jacob knew what he was doing. "I know, my son, I know," Jacob said. Manasseh also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he. The pattern continued. The younger elevated over the older God's choices, confounding human expectations. Jacob was remembering his own story, how he, the younger, had received the blessing over Esau. Then Jacob blessed Joseph himself with words of profound beauty. The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life, long to this day. The angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. When the time came for Jacob to bless all his sons, he gathered them around his deathbed. Each received a prophecy, some blessing, some judgment, all truth. But when he came to Joseph, the words poured out like a flood. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob, by the shepherd, the stone of Israel, by the God of your father, who will help you, and by the Almighty, who will bless you with blessings of heaven, above blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors, up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. After blessing his sons and giving instructions for his burial, Jacob drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last. Joseph fell on his father's face, wept over him, and kissed him. Then he commanded the physicians to embalm his father, a process that took 40 days. And the Egyptians mourned for Jacob 70 days, almost as long as they would mourn a pharaoh. The funeral procession to Canaan was magnificent. Joseph went up, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, all the elders of the land of Egypt, all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Chariots and horsemen accompanied them, a very great gathering. At the threshing floor of Atad beyond the Jordan, they mourned with a great and very solemn lamentation. The Canaanites who witnessed it said, "This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians." The second most powerful man in the world was burying his father with honor that kings would envy. After the burial, the brothers faced a new fear. What if Joseph had only been kind to them for their father's sake? Now that Jacob was dead, would Joseph finally take his revenge? They sent a message to Joseph claiming Jacob had commanded them before his death to say, "Please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you." It may have been a lie, a desperate fabrication, but it revealed their ongoing guilt and fear. When Joseph received the message, he wept. After all these years, after all his demonstrations of forgiveness, they still feared him. They still didn't understand. The brothers came and fell down before his face, saying, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph's response was one of the most profound theological statements in all of Scripture. "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." This was the ultimate perspective on suffering and providence. Joseph saw his entire life: the coat, the dreams, the pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison, the elevation, as God's sovereign plan to preserve not just his family, but many nations. Every betrayal had been a step toward salvation. Every suffering had been purposeful. Joseph lived to be 110 years old. He saw his great-grandchildren watch the family of 70 grow into a multitude. He saw the promises to Abraham beginning to be fulfilled. They were becoming a great nation, though not yet in their own land. As Joseph approached death, he gathered his brothers one last time. His final words were not about his achievements or his power, but about the future. "I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made them take an oath: "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." This was faith speaking. Joseph knew that Egypt, for all its glory, was not their home. He knew that God would fulfill his promises. He wanted his bones to rest in the promised land, even if it took centuries to get there.
When Joseph died, he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. But that coffin was not buried. It remained with the children of Israel, a constant reminder of his faith and their destiny. 400 years later, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, he took Joseph's bones with him. After 40 years in the wilderness, Joshua finally buried Joseph in Shechem, in the very land his brothers had been pasturing flocks when they sold him into slavery. The circle was complete. Yes, epilogue. The dream fulfilled. The story of Joseph is more than just a tale of personal triumph over adversity. It is a profound meditation on the sovereignty of God, the nature of forgiveness, and the mysterious ways in which suffering can become salvation. Consider the dreams that started it all. Young Joseph dreamed of his brothers' sheaves bowing to his sheaf, of the sun, moon, and stars bowing to him. These dreams seemed to promise personal glory, individual elevation. Joseph, in his youthful arrogance, probably imagined himself as a great ruler, with his family as his subjects. But the reality was far different and far greater than his imagination. Yes, his brothers did bow to him, but not as conquered subjects. They bowed as desperate men seeking bread, and he received them as a loving brother offering salvation. The dreams were not about Joseph's glory, but about God's provision. Joseph was elevated not to be served, but to serve, not to rule over his family, but to save them. Every element of Joseph's suffering was necessary for the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan. If his brothers had not hated him, he would not have been sold. If he had not been sold, he would not have gone to Egypt. If he had not gone to Egypt, he would not have been in Potiphar's house. If he had not been in Potiphar's house, he would not have been falsely accused. If he had not been falsely accused, he would not have gone to prison. If he had not gone to prison, he would not have met the cupbearer. If he had not met the cupbearer, he would not have been called to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. If he had not interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he would not have become second in command. If he had not become second in command, he could not have saved Egypt and his family from starvation. Remove any link in this chain, and the whole story collapses. What seemed like random cruelty was actually precise providence.
What felt like abandonment was actually positioning. What looked like the death of dreams was actually their birth. Joseph's story also speaks to the nature of forgiveness. When Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, he had every right to revenge. Egyptian law would have supported him. No one would have blamed him. His brothers expected it, even seemed to accept it as just. But Joseph chose forgiveness, and not just superficial forgiveness. He provided for his brothers, protected them, elevated them. He gave them the best land in Egypt. He introduced them to Pharaoh. He made sure their children were educated and provided for. This was not mere absence of revenge, but active blessing of those who had wronged him. Why? Because Joseph had come to see a bigger picture. "You meant evil against me," he said, "but God meant it for good." Joseph understood that holding on to bitterness would be like drinking poison and expecting his brothers to die. He understood that forgiveness was not just releasing them from guilt, but releasing himself from the prison of resentment. Moreover, Joseph understood that his brothers were different men than they had been. The test with Benjamin proved it. Judah's offer to take Benjamin's place showed a complete transformation. They had learned from their sin, grown from their guilt, changed through their suffering. To punish them for who they used to be when they had become someone new would be its own form of injustice. The story also reveals profound truths about identity and purpose. In Egypt, Joseph was given an Egyptian name, married an Egyptian wife, and rose to Egyptian power. He could have forgotten his Hebrew identity, assimilated completely into the dominant culture. Who could have blamed him? His own people had rejected him. But Joseph never forgot who he was. When his first son was born, he named him Manasseh, making to forget, not to forget his identity, but to forget the pain while remembering the lesson. When his second son was born, he named him Ephraim, fruitful, acknowledging that God had made him fruitful even in the land of his affliction. He maintained his faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even in a land of thousands of gods. He kept his moral standards, even when tempted by Potiphar's wife. He remembered his family, even when they had forgotten him. He held on to the promise of the promised land, even while ruling in Egypt. This persistence of identity, despite circumstances, speaks to every person who has ever felt displaced, rejected, or forgotten. Joseph shows us that our circumstances do not define us. Our faith does. Our position does not determine our purpose. Our calling does. Our past does not dictate our future. God's plan does. The story of Joseph also foreshadows greater truths to come. Joseph, the beloved son, was rejected by his brothers, sold for silver, falsely accused, and left for dead. But through his suffering, he brought salvation to the world. Sound familiar? Many centuries later, another beloved son would be rejected by his brothers, sold for silver, falsely accused, and left for dead. But through his suffering, he would bring salvation, not just to one nation, but to all nations. Not just from physical famine, but from spiritual death. Joseph's story is thus not just history, but prophecy, not just narrative, but theology, not just one man's journey, but humanity's story. It tells us that God is working even when we cannot see Him, that He has purposes even in our pain, that He can bring beauty from ashes and glory from graves. As we leave Joseph's story, we leave with questions for our own lives. What dreams has God given us that seem impossible? What pits have we been thrown into that feel like the end? What prisons are we in that seem permanent? What betrayals have we suffered that seem unforgivable? Joseph's life declares that no pit is too deep for God to reach into, no prison too strong for him to open, no betrayal too bitter for him to sweeten, no dream too dead for him to resurrect. The God who was with Joseph in the pit and the palace is the same God who is with us in our valleys and our victories. The young man who once wore a coat of many colors ended his life wrapped in something far more precious, the fulfilled promises of God. The dreamer who was mocked for his visions lived to see them all come true in ways he never imagined. The brother who was sold for 20 pieces of silver became the savior of the very ones who sold him. This is the story of Joseph, but more than that, it is the story of the God who takes what was meant for evil and uses it for good, who takes the rejected stones and makes them cornerstones, who takes dreamers thrown into pits and raises them to palaces. The dreams we dream when given by God never really die. They may be buried for a season, hidden for years, tested by fire and tried by time. But in the end, they will rise refined and purified, accomplishing not just what we imagined, but infinitely more. For with God, the dreamer's journey never ends in the pit. It always ends in purpose. The path may be longer than expected, harder than hoped, darker than desired. But the destination is always worth the journey, and the dream fulfilled is always greater than the dream first given. This is the testimony of Joseph, son of Jacob, dreamer of dreams, interpreter of visions, slave who became ruler, prisoner who became prince, rejected brother who became family savior. His bones may rest in Shechem, but his story lives forever, inspiring every dreamer who has ever wondered if God has forgotten their dreams. He has not forgotten. He never forgets. The dreams he gives will come to pass in his time and his way, for his glory and for our good. And all God's dreamers said, Amen.